For most of its history, the Japanese motor industry has had a category for small vehicles known as Kei Cars. These are restricted in terms of dimensions, engine capacity, and latterly power output. In return, owners have benefited from lower tax and insurance, and in some cases exemption from parking restrictions. The Kei truck category was also very important and successful, but that it will be separate video on this channel. These are certainly pint-sized classic cars with a difference. From 1949 until 1955, Kei car regulations changed comparatively rapidly, with different capacity limits for vehicles with 2- and 4-stroke engines. They settled down in 1955 and remained at 360 cubic centimeters, regardless of engine type, for the next 21 years. The most famous of the very early Kei cars was launched at the start of the 360 cubic centimeters era. The Suzuki was the first car developed by Suzuki, which had until then built only motorcycles. Inspired by the slightly earlier German Lloyd 400, whose length, width, and 386 cubic centimeters engine were however too large for it to qualify as a Kei car, the Suzuki remained in production, with several changes for 14 years. Like Suzuki, Subaru was inspired by the Kei regulations to produce its first car. Under its peculiarly shaped body, the 360 featured a rear-mounted 2-stroke engine. Several thousand examples were exported to the U.S., where Consumer Reports rated it not acceptable. In an article published in April 1969, the magazine criticized its performance, handling, braking, safety, and windscreen demisting, and concluded, "It was a pleasure to squirm out of the Subaru, slam the door, and walk away." In Japan, where road conditions were very different and tiny cars made more sense, the 360 was popular enough for Subaru to keep it in production from 1958 until 1971. Mazda's first powered vehicle was the tiny Mazda Go 3-wheeled truck launched in 1931. Its first car was the R360, which met the Kei regulations as they stood in 1960. This 4-seat coupe was powered by a 356 cubic centimeters V-twin engine, which also powered a pickup and the larger P360 Carroll Saloon of 1962. The R360 was discontinued in 1966. The more practical P360 Carroll remained in production for a further 4 years. Honda S360. If you said the S360 was one of the most beautiful Kei cars ever built, I wouldn't disagree. Unusually for a car of this type, it had a twin-cam 4-cylinder engine which produced its maximum power output of 33 brake horsepower at 9,000 RPM. Sadly, it never went into production, despite being enthusiastically received when it made its debut at the Suzuka circuit in June 1962 and when it went on display at the Japan National Auto Show 4 months later. Honda felt that the sports car market in Japan was too small, and that a model with a 356 cubic centimeters engine would not be popular anywhere else. Instead, Honda reworked the S360 into the S500, which required a wider body. The length was increased at the same time. In both dimensions, the S500 was too large to meet the requirements of the Kei class. The Minico was produced over 8 generations until 2011. The first model, launched in 1962, was essentially the passenger car version of the Mitsubishi 360 truck and pickup which had been introduced the previous year. In each case, the engine was a 359 cubic centimeters air-cooled 2-stroke twin which produced a mere 17 brake horsepower in its original form. A more powerful engine from the same family was used in the later Hopestar on 360, which, as we'll see, was the basis of the original Suzuki Jimy. The Fronte 360 was the first Kei car, and the second Suzuki after the Fronte 800, to be named after the company that built it, rather than being branded as a Suzuki. The continued use of the Fronte badge was confusing. While earlier models were front-wheel drive, as mentioned previously, the 360's engine was mounted at the back and drove the rear wheels. In 1968, Suzuki introduced a high-performance 36 brake horsepower version called the SS360. Its arrival was publicized by a high-speed run along the Autostrada A1 from Milan to Naples, in which two SS360s were driven by Sterling Moss and Japanese motorcycle racer Mitsuo Ito. Suzuki Jimy, first generation, 1970. As mentioned previously, the first Jimy was a development of the Hopestar on 360 off-roader. Suzuki replaced the engine, borrowed from the Mitsubishi Minica, with an air-cooled 359 cubic centimeters two-stroke twin of its own, but retained the four-wheel drive, an extremely unusual feature for an early Kei vehicle. Suzuki had updated the original Jimy in 1972, and 3 years later it became available in export markets, where Kei rules did not apply, with a 539 cubic centimeters three-cylinder two-stroke. It was essentially the same as the 359 cubic centimeters unit the Jimy had started out with, but with a third cylinder added. The new Kei regulations of 1976 allowed Suzuki to sell the Jimy with this engine on its home market. Since the Jimy was classed as a commercial vehicle in Japan, it was not subject to the same emissions requirements as a passenger car, and did not therefore have to be fitted with the cleaner but otherwise similar engine used in the Fronte. The Life was Honda's replacement for the N360, and was powered by the 356 cubic centimeters water-cooled twin which would later appear in the Z360. Honda used almost all the space permitted by the Kei regulations, coming within 5 mm of the maximum length and width. Production came to an end in late 1974. It would be more than a decade before Honda returned to the Kei class with a passenger car. After a 23-year pause, Honda brought back the Life name for a Kei MPV introduced in 1997. It replaced the Today, and like that car it was fitted with a three-cylinder engine. Of the 5 generations of the Life nameplate, this model was by far the rarest. It was in production for only a year and a half, for reasons which are about to become clear. The problem with the second Life was that it was introduced shortly before the Kei regulations were changed to allow for larger vehicles. Other manufacturers took the opportunity to replace or redesign cars they had been building for several years. Honda was obliged to do this with a car which had only just gone on sale. The third Life looked similar to the second, but it was both longer and wider. The engine was updated at the same time, and now produced 63 brake horsepower with turbocharging, or 52 brake horsepower without. After being produced in various forms for 20 years, the Subaru Rex was finally replaced by the Vivio in 1992. The new car had a 658 cubic centimeters four-cylinder engine which was available with 2 valves per cylinder and a carburetor at one end of the scale, 4 valves per cylinder, fuel injection, a supercharger and an intercooler at the other, and several combinations in between. A year after launch, future World Rally champion Colin McRae drove a supercharged Vivio on the 1993 Safari. He retired with suspension failure. The full-size Pajero SUV, known as the Shogun in the UK, had 2 smaller counterparts, the more compact Pinnin and the tiny Mini. While the grown-up Pajero was nearly 5 meters long and had engines of up to 3.5 liters, the Mini was a Kei vehicle measuring just 3.3 meters and powered by a 659 cubic centimeters four-cylinder engine. The engine was offered with 16 valves and natural aspiration, or 20 valves, and a turbocharger. In the latter form, it produced 63 brake horsepower, the maximum permissible output for the class. The flurry of activity among Kei car manufacturers in 1998 included a revamp of the Pajero Mini. Its length and width were increased following the rule change, though of course it was still far smaller than the full-size Pajero. Otherwise, it remained much the same as before, though a switch from round to rectangular headlights made it look more modern. In this form, the Mini had an impressively long life. The final anniversary edition went on sale on March 26, 2012. The Today marked Honda's return to the Kei passenger car class. It was a three-door hatchback initially powered by the same engine used in the Acti truck and street MPV. This was replaced in 1988 by a three-cylinder unit measuring 547 cubic centimeters. When a new set of Kei regulations was introduced, the Today was given larger bumpers, extending the overall length beyond the previous legal maximum, and a 656 cubic centimeters version of the three-cylinder engine. The Beat was the car that the production version of the S360 might have been nearly 3 decades earlier if Honda hadn't canned the project. Neatly styled by Italian design house Pininfarina, it featured a development of the 656 cubic centimeters engine used in the earlier Today and Street. As fitted to the Beat though, it produced a startling 63 brake horsepower without the benefit of forced induction. This would be the maximum permitted output when the Kei regulations changed for the final time in 1998. The Servo indirectly replaced the coupe version of the second-generation Fronte, which had been launched in 1971. Like the new Fronte, the Servo was powered by a rear-mounted 539 cubic centimeters three-cylinder two-stroke. Unfortunately, this produced far less power than the best of the old 360s, so the Servo was significantly slower than the old Fronte coupe. The Servo was never sold in this form in Europe, but a derivative called the SC100 was. This version had a 970 cubic centimeters four-cylinder engine and was so much fun that it was known in the UK as the Whiskit. The Cappuccino was introduced in the same year as the Honda Beat and proved to be one of its closest rivals. Like Honda, Suzuki took an existing three-cylinder engine, 657 cubic centimeters in this case, and modified it to produce a maximum of 63 brake horsepower. Unlike Honda, it achieved this by fitting a turbocharger. The Cappuccino lasted for 2 years longer than the Beat, remaining in production until 1998. If I left out some important Kei car, please tell me in the comments. Thank you for your attention and have a nice day.